Yes, thanks, Jonathan. I'll be talking about everyone's favorite topic, regulatory timelines. Um, so Jonathan sort of laid out a plan for a path forward here. So where does that put us? Well, we just talked about the strategic plan, which is going to be a priority to develop for next year. Jonathan says in January, we're going to start working on that. So Dave, you got to write this thing up quick. Then if there's enough interest, we can get the scallop enhancement into the strategic plan for the fishery. So that strategic plan will be developed throughout next year. So if that becomes a high priority for the scallop fleet, in 2026, we can start working on a more comprehensive amendment or framework to make the sort of changes that Jonathan was talking about, codifying it in the MVP, in the FMP, and talking about all the different processes and maybe different techniques that we may use. And because as we've seen the last few days, there may be several different things that we're trying to do here. So the amendment process could start in 2026. When that happens, you're gonna initiate that amendment in 2026, and then in 2026 and 27 is like where the bulk of that work is done. The creativity about coming up with these different techniques. We're gonna go out to the public. We're gonna have scoping. We're gonna hear what the public thinks about these things. What avenues should we pursue? Developing different alternatives for the way that this change could work in the FMP. And when we're doing that, we're thinking about all these different things. How is this work being funded? How are we going to determine who does this sort of work? What type of different permits are we going to need for all the different times and places that we're handling scallops and doing different operations out there? Is there what other applicable laws do we have to deal with that could be a potential barrier to this sort of effort? Where are we going to do this? Where are we transplanting seeds? Where are we seeding scallops? And ultimately, how are these scallops that have enhanced the fishery, how are they going to be distributed across the fishery in an equitable way? So as we develop those sort of details in this amendment in 2026 and 27, finally in 27, the council could finalize that amendment. They could go out to public hearings. They could take final action and then hand it over to the agency where the real fun starts. And we would put this into the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. And we would propose this amendment and then finalize it. And depending on the controversiality of it, all the other things the types of comments we'd have, if people are very supportive of this overall, this could happen relatively quickly. This could take a long time, depending on how complicated these things are. But I think this seems like sort of a drag, I think, but I think this is a pretty lightning fast timeline for this sort of effort. And I think what we've seen over the last day and a half is that there's a lot of other work to be done to get us there. And we're not 100% ready to go yet. So I think what's really important is that if we really feel like this is the path forward, we need to start taking these actions now. And so I don't know, do we have time for questions? Do you still want to do that? So I guess we'll pause. We're going to do breakout groups in a little bit. And then Jonathan and I will answer some questions.
Thanks to the three presenters, and this is more of a comment and a plea than a question. You summed up, I think, what I was thinking, that this process has to go forward in the framework you're talking about. But can we have a parallel timeline where all these other things that were talked about in this room can be begun in independent fashion? You know, in the state of Maine, in our research labs, in our hatcheries. And so that by 2028, we actually have some real information to inform the rest of the process.
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan and I talked about that when we were developing this presentation, and what we ultimately decided is that, well, we can show this sort of Magnuson timeline for the scallop fishery and the council work. But there are at least 3 or 4 other items, I think, that are happening. You know, we're developing hatchery techniques, we're developing the sowing techniques, we're finding areas and we're scouting out different habitats. The scallop FMP itself may be working on those specific things. There's a laundry list of things that need to be happening simultaneously. And so I think that's why it's imperative that everyone here work together. And that'll be one of the things we're talking about in the breakout groups is like, what are the next steps for each group and kind of who's responsible for moving that part of the effort forward?
I completely agree with that. Kind of this 2 tracks, the management and then research. And I think this whole process would benefit greatly from identifying other groups like the Milford Lab that are working to advance enhancement versus a model that relies solely on the scallop RSA, which is, I think has been successful in other parts of the resource, conservation engineering, that sort of thing. But the RSA can be slow. You don't have a lot of control over exactly what gets proposed. And so I think it is worth identifying other sources of funding, areas of interest that can help move this forward, both at the state level and at the federal level. So I would just encourage folks to think broadly about where money can come from.
Hi. Hi, Sarah Borsetti from Rutgers. So the scallop enhancement conversation is happening and the surf clam enhancement conversation is happening. Is there any overlap between kind of the discussions at the council's level on how to develop these mechanisms? I know that they're 2 different fisheries. The kind of reason for the enhancement might be very different, but we're talking about a lot of the same things.
So we say at the same time? No. But that's not to say that there shouldn't be or that there couldn't be. And you know, from my perspective, this is the real kickoff of this scallop effort. And they had a similar sort of meeting for surf clams. And so I think now there is probably some room for collaboration and maybe to have some continuity between